So this week, as I was loading my sermon onto the computer so that I could get it onto YouTube, I somehow deleted all the footage, which is very tragic because it was quite an eventful sermon. So I'm going to get started here and try to do this over again. So this morning I want to talk to you about cliches. Now everybody knows what a cliche is. A cliche is an overused phrase or a story, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. That's a cliche. And sometimes we use cliches so much that we start to think they're probably proverbs or they're in the Bible somewhere. They have to be true because your mama said them to you all the time. Like, cleanliness is next to godliness. That is a cliche. Now, I even used a cliche last week in my sermon, and I was talking about building relationships and living a life of love and living a life like Christ. And we as Christians know that we're supposed to live our lives like Christ, but we just get so used to being Christian that we forget what that really means. And so last week I had said, let's practice what we preach and go out and build relationships and go out and love people. Now this week my sermon is a big old cliche. And the title of my sermon this week is WWJD. What would Jesus do? Now I remember when that phrase first came out, it was pretty profound. And as Christians, we should know what Jesus would do. But like I said earlier, we get so used to doing things and we get so used to being Christian and we get so caught up in our lives that we just sometimes forget what Jesus would do. And as I was talking last week about building relationships and living a life of love, I want this week to look at what Jesus would do. How would Jesus live this life of love? How would he build those relationships with people? So I'm going to go to Mark chapter 5, and this chapter is a typical day in the life of Jesus Christ, and there are 3 distinct stories in Mark chapter 5. Now the first story is the story of the demoniac of Gadara. Now we all know this story because I preached on this story just a few weeks ago. And if you'll remember, Jesus went into the tombs to this man who suffered from demon possession. He cried out at night. He cut himself with stones. He was running around naked. He was tormented. And no one wanted to be near him. So they isolated him. And he isolated himself. And he chose to live in this place of death. But Jesus went into the tombs. He went into this graveyard. And he ministered to this man that no one else wanted to even come near. That's what Jesus did. And second, there's the woman with the issue of blood. Now this is where I'm going to start reading. And I'm going to start with verse 25. And I'm going to go through 34. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many physicians, and over the years she spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had only gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe, for she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed from her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone from him. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? His disciples looked at him. Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me? But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling with the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. What did Jesus do? Jesus was available. And Jesus acknowledged her. That's what Jesus did. Third, we have Jairus' daughter. And I'm going to pick up here at verse 35. While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. And they told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use in troubling the teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just have faith." Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let them go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. And he went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave. And he took the little girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. And holding her hand, he said to her, "Talitha kum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. And they were overwhelmed and amazed. And Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. Now, I have preached from all 3 of these stories numerous times. And this chapter is so rich. It is so rich with wisdom, and it is so rich with pictures. And I could stand here and I could paint a picture for you of all the things that I've found over the years in this chapter, and I just don't think I would finish it in one day. And I've read this chapter multiple times. I've read this chapter many, many times, and as I was looking and searching for a sermon for this week, because I wanted to do a series on evangelism, and I wanted to do a series on building relationships with people and loving people. And God brought me here, and I was like, "God, I just don't think this is the chapter that you're trying to show me," because I've read it so many times. The demoniac of Gadara and the woman with the issue of blood and Jairus' daughter, they were almost cliche. Just normal. Just every day. But I love how the Word is alive, and I love how God opens it up to us when we need it the most. And as I was reading this, God opened my eyes and showed me something fresh in this Word. And I think God has a message for our church. Not just our church, but the church of today. You see, our call, it goes farther than just the lost. It goes farther than reaching out to people who don't know Jesus. And that was the main message that I remember getting when I first got saved. Okay, now you're saved and you have to reach the lost. You have to tell the world about Jesus Christ. That is the evangelical message of the church. And that's true. That's very, very true. But recently, I've been watching an exodus of sorts from church, or any semblance of church, anything that looks like church. And I've been doing a little bit of research on it, because anytime you see people leaving in droves, you need to find out what is going on. So I've been reading a couple of books, and I've been reading some articles, and I've found that there are 3 groups that are popping up. And the first group is, I want to get this right, is the SBNR group, the spiritual but not religious group. And I have many friends who say this: I'm spiritual but I'm not religious. And I believe that I'm spiritual but not religious, but probably because of a whole different reason. I have a different idea of what religion is. But this is the largest group. These are people that don't claim any denomination, they don't claim any faith, but they are spiritual people. And the second group is the nuns. And I love to say this, the nuns. And I'm not talking about the little the little ladies that are wearing the black habits, that are nuns. I'm talking about nuns, as in none of the above. And this is what they're calling themselves. I do not affiliate with any denomination. I do not affiliate with any faith. I may be spiritual and I may not be spiritual. And that's none of your business. This is the nuns. This is the second group. And then the third group, they're called the dones, as in stick a fork in me. I'm done. I'm done with church. I'm done with religion. I'm done with spirituality. I am done. Why is this happening? What is going on? And I can be honest with you. I have felt like I was in that third group before. I'm done. I'm done. But somehow God wouldn't allow that. God wouldn't allow that. And today I'm standing before you and I'm asking you what is happening, what is going on. Why are we losing people in droves? And I'll tell you what I think is happening and what I think God is showing me. I think the church is bleeding out. It's bleeding out. And I want to get back to Mark chapter 5. And I want to show you what God has shown me. And I'm going to pick up verse 25 again. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many physicians, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Now I want you to look at the one thing there. I want you to look at the number. She had been bleeding for 12 years. It's a number. Now, numbers are very significant in the Bible. And when I discovered this as a young Christian, I remember being so excited that when I read verses that had numbers in it, that if I would just look a little deeper and dig a little deeper at what that number represented, it would give me a whole new dimension of what the Word was saying or what God was showing me, and it would make it richer. And the number 12 is found in Scripture 187 times. Now I want you to think about it for a moment. You think about the 12 tribes of Israel. It's the government of God. You think about the 12 disciples. It's the first church. This 12 represents the church. Represents the church. And I want to show you something else that I feel like God is showing me. In verse 26, where he speaks of physicians, I looked at that word and I was like, maybe that means something else. Maybe there's something a little deeper there, but it really just means physicians. But as I looked a little deeper, I realized that it's the same word used in the same context when Jesus said in Mark 2, verse 17, when Jesus heard it, he said unto them, they that are whole have no need of the physician. The physician. Jesus is talking about himself in this verse. The physician. Jesus is the physician. Now I want you to follow me here because I believe I see a parallel here. Jesus is the great shepherd, right? And pastors and church leaders, we're under shepherds. Jesus is the great teacher. We as church leaders are teachers. Jesus is the physician, and we are physicians. You see, she had given everything she had, and she didn't get better, and she began to bleed out. And I believe this is a picture of the wounded church, the church that is bleeding out. Now, anytime something bleeds out, it dies eventually. Not just people, but things. Your bank account starts bleeding, guess what's going to happen? You're going to be bankrupt. So let's look at Jairus' daughter. And I want to pick up at verse 38. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she is only asleep. And the crowd laughed at him. But he made all of them leave. And he took the girl's father and mother and 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand. Sometimes we just need a touch. Sometimes we just need someone to hold our hands. Holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, she was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. And they were overwhelmed and totally amazed. And Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. Just give her something to eat. Replenish the soil. Replenish the church. Feed her and protect her. Don't go around telling everybody that she was on her deathbed. Don't go around telling everybody that she almost died. Just feed her. Who is the church? The church is you and me. It's not a pile of bricks with stained glass windows. It's the people. It's the people. And God is calling us to minister to the church, to the wounded church, to the nuns, to the duns, to the spiritual, but not religious, to the ones that are piling out in droves, and to the ones that have never been. They've never been in the doors. So let's go back and let's don't forget about Legion. You see, he was not a Christian. And the verse is very clear when it talks about he was possessed by evil spirits. Now that word possess speaks of ownership. So Legion did not belong to Christ yet. But Jesus went straight into the tombs. He went straight into that place of death. And he saved him. And I'm going to read at verse 18 and I'm going to go through 20. And this is after Jesus had set him free from demonic possession and he was clothed and in his right mind. Verse 18 says, as Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus said, no, go home to your family and tell them everything the Lord has done for you and how merciful he has been. So the man started off to visit the 10 towns of that region and began to proclaim the great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed at what he told them. Jesus instructed this man, go and tell everything. But that's not what he said at Jairus' house. He gave him strict orders, don't tell anybody what has happened. Why? What's the difference in the two stories? I want you to look at the number in this verse. It's 10. Visit the 10 towns. Not 12, it's 10. 10. It represents testimony. Jesus gave this man life. He saved him. He brought him out of the tombs, and his testimony, Jesus wanted him to go tell his testimony. Spread the good news, not the gossip, not the fact that the church is bleeding. Go and spread the good news. Tell people that I'm still saving lives and that I'm still going into the tombs. Testimony. You see, when people hear that Jesus is going into tombs and he's rescuing people who are tormented and in pain and hurting, who are dying, they want to meet him. But when they hear that the church is dying, they run. They run. What exactly did Jesus do that day? What did Jesus do that day? On Mark 5th. On Mark 5th. The first thing, he went into a place where nobody wants to go. He went into a place of death to help a man that nobody wanted. He walked into the tombs and he loved a man that nobody loved. And he gave him life. Jesus Christ took the church into the tombs. He took the church into that place that nobody else wanted to go. And he brought life into a place of death. And second, the woman with the issue of blood. The woman with the issue of blood had been bleeding for 12 years. Now, according to the law in Leviticus, this made this woman unclean. She was unclean, and anyone she came near and touched became unclean as well, according to the law in Leviticus. But she knew If I can just get to Jesus and touch His garment, my wounds will be healed. Now Jesus was walking around. Jesus was surrounded by people. People that had been around Him so much and so often and so long that guess what? They were no longer touching Him. They were no longer touching Him because when she came in, she truly touched Him. And He stopped. But His disciples and His followers, they were all around Him and none of them were truly touching Him because they had been around Jesus for so long. He had become cliche. But this woman touched Him. And she pressed through everybody that was blocking Him. Have you ever felt like someone was blocking you from Jesus? Have you ever felt like you couldn't get to Jesus because of all the people around Him? Can't see Him anymore? He's there. You just have to push. And you just have to press through. Jesus stopped the moment this woman touched Him. He stopped and He acknowledged her. And He said to her, "My daughter." He called her daughter. And the bleeding stopped. She was no longer bleeding out. She was healed of her wound. He recognized her. And He called her daughter in front of that entire crowd. The entire crowd that was trying to keep her away from Him. The entire crowd that was blocking Jesus from this unclean woman. He stopped and He acknowledged her and He said, "My daughter." He wants to acknowledge you. He wants to acknowledge you. And number 3. He held the hand of the young girl whom everyone thought was done. They thought she was dead. And He walked in there and He held her hand and He said, "Talitha kum." Rise up. Rise up. He received her. He revived her. And He replenished her. And that's what we're called to do. That's what we're supposed to do.